In a quiet suburban town, the streets were lined with neat houses and manicured lawns. At first glance, it seemed like the kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. But beneath the surface there was an unspoken tension, a history of racial divides that lingered in the minds of its residents. Amelia Carter, a confident and successful black lawyer in her late 30s, was known for her sharp intellect and unshakable sense of justice. Having grown up in this town, she was no stranger to its challenges. Amelia had built a reputation for herself, not just as a skilled attorney, but as someone who fought tirelessly for the underrepresented. She had faced obstacles at every turn, but her resilience had made her a respected name in the legal world. On the other side of the town's story was Officer Hansen, a white cop in his 40s who wore his authority like a shield. Hansen had a reputation, too, though not the kind anyone should be proud of. He was known for his aggressive demeanor and a long-standing history of racial profiling. Despite whispers of misconduct, Hansen had always managed to avoid consequences, protected by a system that seemed to turn a blind eye to his actions. It was late one evening. The town bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Amelia was driving home after a long meeting, her car cutting through the quiet streets. She was tired but relieved, looking forward to a well-earned rest. As she rounded a corner, flashing blue and red lights lit up her rearview mirror. A sigh escaped her lips as she eased her car to the side of the road. Officer Hansen stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his belt with exaggerated authority. His footsteps were heavy as he approached her window. Amelia rolled it down, her calm, collected demeanor intact. "License and registration," Hansen barked, his tone sharp and condescending. Amelia handed over her documents without a word. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice even. "You were speeding," he replied curtly, "and driving suspiciously." Amelia raised an eyebrow. "Suspiciously? I'm not sure I understand." Hansen smirked, leaning closer. "That's not for you to understand, ma'am. Just answer my questions." Amelia remained composed, though a flicker of irritation crossed her face. "I wasn't speeding, and I'd appreciate it if you clarified what you mean by suspicious." Hansen's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Amelia hesitated but complied, stepping out into the cool night air. Hansen circled her car, muttering accusations about broken taillights and improper signals, none of which were true. Amelia stood quietly, arms crossed, watching him. "Officer," she said calmly, "I know my rights." Hansen stopped and turned, a mocking grin spreading across his face. "Oh, let me guess. You're a lawyer, right?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "You people always think you know everything." Amelia's jaw tightened, but she didn't rise to his bait. "I am a lawyer," she said evenly, "and I suggest you proceed carefully." Hansen's grin faltered for a moment before returning. "We'll see about that," he muttered, as he handed her a warning ticket and walked back to his patrol car. As Amelia got back into her car and drove away, her mind raced. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered someone like Hansen, but it was the first time she felt compelled to do something about it. Her resolve hardened as she gripped the steering wheel. Tonight wasn't the end of this story, it was just the beginning. The cool night air was quiet, broken only by the hum of passing cars in the distance. Amelia's car idled on the side of the road, the flashing red and blue lights behind her casting an ominous glow in her rearview mirror. She took a steadying breath as Officer Hansen approached her window, his flashlight beaming into the car, landing briefly on her hands resting on the steering wheel. "License and registration," he barked without introduction, his tone sharp and dismissive. Amelia retrieved her documents calmly and handed them over. "Here you go, officer," she said evenly. "Is there a problem?" Hansen didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced at her license, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You were speeding," he said curtly, and driving suspiciously. Suspiciously? Amelia asked, her voice steady but questioning. Could you clarify what you mean by that? Hansen leaned in closer, his expression hardening. I'm the one asking the questions here. Where are you headed? Home, she replied, her gaze unwavering. From where? A meeting, she answered, keeping her tone calm. Is there a specific reason for this stop, officer? Hansen's lips curled into a smirk. You ask a lot of questions for someone being pulled over. Step out of the vehicle. Amelia paused. Officer, with all due respect, I don't believe there's a valid reason for me to exit my car. Am I being detained? Hansen's smirk disappeared, replaced by a scowl. Are you resisting now? He said, his voice rising slightly. Because I can make this a whole lot worse for you. Amelia sighed inwardly, knowing where this was headed. Reluctantly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out of the car, keeping her movements deliberate and measured. Hansen circled her vehicle slowly, his flashlight sweeping across the interior as if searching for something to validate his actions. I see you like to keep your car spotless, he said sarcastically, opening the glove compartment without permission. Amelia's jaw tightened, but she stayed silent for the moment. You don't have the right to search my car without probable cause, she said firmly, her voice calm but assertive. Hansen ignored her, continuing to rummage through her belongings. When he found nothing, he straightened up, his frustration visible. You know, he said, turning toward her, people like you think you can just drive around and question authority. Amelia crossed her arms, refusing to back down. I'm not questioning authority. I'm holding it accountable. And what you're doing right now is an abuse of power. Hansen laughed, the sound cold and dismissive. Oh, let me guess. You're a lawyer or something? He mocked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Amelia's expression didn't change. Actually, I am, and you're making a big mistake, officer. Hansen's smile faltered for a split second before returning, more forced this time. Is that so? Well, let me give you a piece of advice, Ms. Lawyer. Don't push your luck. He handed her a warning ticket and gestured for her to get back in her car. Amelia complied, her face calm but her mind racing. She started the engine and drove away, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. This wasn't just a routine stop. It was a blatant abuse of power, and she couldn't let it slide. As the flashing lights disappeared in her rearview mirror, Amelia made a silent promise to herself. Hansen might think he'd gotten the last word tonight, but she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Amelia's home office as she sat at her desk, her laptop open in front of her. The warning ticket from the previous night lay next to her, a glaring reminder of the humiliation she had endured. She replayed the incident in her mind, her frustration growing with every detail. But anger alone wasn't going to solve this. She knew she had the tools to fight back, and that's exactly what she intended to do. Amelia began reviewing the laws surrounding traffic stops and searches. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she drafted a formal complaint against Officer Hansen, detailing his conduct during the stop. She carefully cited legal precedents, ensuring her complaint was airtight. This isn't just about me, she muttered to herself. This is about everyone he's done this to. Her thoughts drifted to the stories she'd heard over the years, stories of people, mostly from her community, who had been stopped, harassed, or humiliated by Hansen. She realized it wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern, and it was time to expose it. The scene shifted to a montage of flashbacks, each one building the case against Hansen. A young black teenager recounting how Hansen had accused him of loitering and forced him to empty his pockets on a busy street. A middle-aged woman describing how Hansen had threatened to arrest her for questioning a ticket. A small business owner recalling how Hansen had fined him excessively during routine checks, the fines suspiciously never reaching official records. Each memory highlighted Hansen's unchecked power and the damage he had inflicted on the community. Amelia's determination solidified with each story. Back in her office, Amelia pulled up a local community forum on her laptop. She posted anonymously, asking if anyone else had experienced unfair treatment at the hands of Officer Hansen. Within hours, replies began pouring in. Some were hesitant, sharing vague accounts, while others were detailed and damning. She followed up with those willing to speak further, arranging phone calls and meetings. One by one, she listened to their stories, taking meticulous notes and gathering their testimonies. Each voice added to the growing weight of evidence against Hansen. One particular story stood out. A local father tearfully recounted how his teenage son had been arrested on false charges after a run-in with Hansen. The charges had been dropped later, but the experience had left his son traumatized. "He's never been the same since," the father said, his voice breaking. Amelia felt the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about misconduct, it was about lives disrupted and trust shattered. She realized the case she was building wasn't just against Hansen, but against the system that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. By the end of the week, Amelia had compiled a formidable dossier. It included her own experience, the stories of others, and a timeline of Hansen's misconduct. The evidence was clear, the pattern undeniable. But she knew this was only the first step. She needed to ensure her complaint couldn't be ignored. She reached out to local activists and journalists, sharing parts of her findings to build public pressure. One journalist in particular took an interest. "This is big, Amelia," he said, "but you know the department will push back hard." "I'm ready for that," she replied firmly. "I'm not just doing this for me. I'm doing it for everyone who's been silenced." As she closed her laptop that night, Amelia felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. She had started a fight that wouldn't be easy, but it was a fight worth having. Officer Hansen might have thought he could intimidate her, but he had underestimated who he was dealing with. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as people filled the seats, their whispers bouncing off the polished wooden walls. Reporters jotted notes, cameras clicked, and the air was thick with anticipation. At the center of it all, Officer Greg Hansen strode into the room with a smirk, his uniform pressed and his confidence unshaken. To him, this was just another attempt to tarnish his reputation, something he was certain he could brush off. Seated at the plaintiff's table was Amelia Carter, calm and composed. Representing herself, she exuded a quiet strength that belied the months of preparation leading to this moment. She glanced at the audience behind her, spotting familiar faces from her community, those who had been wronged by Hansen and had come to support her. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The case was called, and it began. Hansen leaned back in his chair, confident that the system would protect him, as it always had. But today, Amelia was ready to challenge that system head-on. Amelia rose to deliver her opening statement. Her voice was steady and authoritative, each word striking with precision. "Your Honor, today we are here to address not just one incident, but a pattern of misconduct by Officer Hansen. This case is not about personal vendettas or misunderstandings. It is about holding accountable those who abuse the power entrusted to them." She walked to the jury, her gaze meeting each member's eyes. "I will show you evidence that proves Officer Hansen has consistently harassed, humiliated, and harmed individuals in our community, particularly those who look like me. And I will demonstrate that his actions are not isolated but part of a larger pattern that cannot be ignored." Hansen's smirk faltered slightly as Amelia returned to her seat. The prosecution called its first witness, a young black man who nervously recounted his encounter with Hansen. "I was walking home from work," he said, his voice shaky, "and he stopped me, said I looked out of place, He searched my bag and found nothing, but still made me sit on the curb for an hour while people stared. Next came a middle-aged woman, her voice trembling with emotion as she described being fined excessively by Hansen during a routine traffic stop. I tried to ask him why, but he just told me to stop questioning him if I didn't want it to get worse. One by one, witnesses came forward, each testimony painting a damning picture of Hansen's behavior. The courtroom grew heavier with each story, the collective weight of his actions becoming impossible to ignore. Then came the key moment. Amelia stood and requested to play footage from Hansen's dash cam. The screen flickered to life, and the room watched as Hansen's aggressive behavior during Amelia's traffic stop played out. His sharp tone, baseless accusations, and unnecessary demands filled the courtroom. The final blow came when Hansen's voice was heard mocking Amelia. "Oh, let me guess. You're a lawyer, right?" The courtroom was silent, the weight of his arrogance hanging in the air. Amelia paused the footage and turned to the jury. "This is not how someone sworn to protect and serve should act. This is not just unprofessional, it's abusive." When it was Hansen's turn to testify, his demeanor shifted. He tried to justify his actions, claiming he was just doing his job and that his actions were taken out of caution for public safety. Amelia, cross-examining him, dismantled his arguments piece by piece. "Officer Hansen," she began, her tone sharp, "can you explain why nearly every complaint filed against you involves people of color? Or why fines you issued never made it to the town's records?" Hansen stammered, his confidence visibly cracking. I don't handle the records directly. That's not my responsibility." "And yet," Amelia continued, "you were the officer who issued these fines, correct? And you were also the officer who conducted these unwarranted stops and searches?" Hansen shifted uncomfortably, his arrogance replaced by unease. "I don't recall every detail." "That's convenient," Amelia cut in, her voice firm. "But the people you harassed, they remember every detail." As the trial neared its conclusion, Amelia delivered her closing argument. "Your Honor, members of the jury, this case is about more than one person. It's about a system that allows individuals like Officer Hansen to operate without accountability. But today we have the chance to say no more, to send a message that justice and fairness are not optional. They are essential." Hansen sat rigidly, his smirk long gone. He avoided the eyes of the jury as the judge prepared to give instructions. The room held its breath as the verdict was read. Hansen was found guilty of misconduct and abuse of power. Gasps and murmurs filled the air as the judge announced that an investigation into the department's practices would follow. Amelia sat back, a mix of relief and resolve washing over her. She had won this battle, but she knew the fight for systemic change was just beginning. The courtroom was silent as the judge's voice cut through the tension. "After reviewing the evidence and testimonies, this court finds Officer Greg Hansen guilty of misconduct and abuse of power." The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, marking the end of a case that had gripped the town. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience. Amelia sat still for a moment, letting the weight of the verdict sink in. She had done it. Hansen was finally being held accountable. But as she glanced around the room, the divided reactions among the townspeople were clear. Some faces showed relief and gratitude, while others wore anger and disbelief. The fault lines of the community were more visible than ever. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Supporters of Amelia held signs that read, "Justice served, and no one is above the law." They cheered as she emerged, their voices mixing with the questions shouted by reporters. "Ms. Carter, how does it feel to win this case? What's your next step? Do you think this will lead to real change?" Amelia raised a hand to quiet the crowd. "This isn't just about one case," she began, her voice calm but firm. "This is about ensuring that no one, no matter their position, is above accountability. It's about creating a system that serves everyone equally. Today is a step in the right direction, but there's still a long road ahead." The crowd erupted into applause, but across the street, another group stood in stark contrast. Supporters of Hansen held their own signs: "Support our officers," and "Stop the witch hunt." Their chants grew louder, their voices filled with anger and resentment. Amelia watched them for a moment, her expression thoughtful. This wasn't a simple victory. The community was fractured, and healing those divides would take more than a courtroom win. That evening, Amelia sat in her office, the events of the day replaying in her mind. The verdict was a victory, but it didn't erase the systemic issues that had allowed Hansen to act unchecked for so long. Her desk was cluttered with notes and articles, evidence of the deeper fight she knew she had to continue. Her phone buzzed with messages. Some were from friends and colleagues congratulating her, while others were from community members sharing their own stories of injustice. But mixed in were angry messages and thinly veiled threats, reminders of the resistance she would face. Amelia sighed, scrolling through the messages before setting her phone down. She looked at a small framed photo on her desk of her late father, who had been a civil rights activist. His words echoed in her mind. "The fight for justice is never easy, but it's always worth it." The scene shifted to the community. A local youth center hosted a meeting where people discussed how to address racial bias and improve accountability in the police department. Amelia was there, listening and offering guidance. The room was filled with a mix of emotions: hope, frustration, determination, but the energy was undeniable. The fight for change had begun to take root. In the police department, an internal investigation was underway. Hansen's case had sparked scrutiny of other officers, and whispers of reform circulated. For the first time, the department's leadership was under pressure to address its long-standing issues. The story ended with Amelia walking through her neighborhood, greeted warmly by some residents while others avoided her gaze. She paused in front of a mural being painted on a brick wall, depicting scales of justice held by diverse hands. A young girl painting the mural looked up at her and smiled. "Do you think things will really change, Miss Carter?" the girl asked. Amelia crouched down, her voice soft but resolute. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step we take brings us closer. And as long as we don't stop fighting, there's always hope." The camera panned out as Amelia stood, the mural behind her shining in the golden glow of the setting sun. The fight for justice was far from over, but the first step had been taken, and it mattered.